Welcome, everyone. I am Erica Piola, Director of the Visual Culture Program, and I'm delighted to be the host of this afternoon's discussion with Dr. Michael Leja. In his talk today, Michael will be discussing his new book, A Flood of Pictures, which explores how the mass circulation of pictures before the Civil War reshaped the culture of a society before the mass appeal, consumption, and commodification of graphics. But before we begin, I would like to note that the talk is about 40 minutes and there will be time for questions and answers. So please place any queries in the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and any time during the program. I would also like to briefly introduce the Library Company and the Visual Culture Program to those who may not be familiar with either. The Library Company was originally started in 1731 as a subscription library by then printer Benjamin Franklin and its discussion group, the Junto. Today, we are a research library for the study of American culture and history before the early 20th century. Our rich holdings include over 1 million books, graphics, ephemera, and art and artifacts, and comprise subject strengths such as African American history, women's history, and visual culture. The latter inspired the implementation of the Visual Culture Program with the mission to promote visual literacy through the creative use of historical visual materials and supports exhibitions, publications, acquisitions, digital projects, public programs, and research fellowships, the latter's deadline having recently passed. Please see the program's website for more details if you wish to apply in the future. The Visual Culture Program also seeks to facilitate talks such as today's that confront, explore, and complicate the social construction of what we see, how we see it, and why we see it as we do, in our understanding of the mass visual culture of the nation before 1950. This afternoon, I am so pleased to host Michael in his discussion of his recent book that took him on research journeys to a number of repositories, including the Library Company, as he sought to examine a mass culture of pictures in formation as printed and spoken words assumed a new role in society. In this vein, Michael deliberately uses words in an engaging and sensorially broad way to describe the pictures that form the focuses of each chapter in A Flood of Pictures. Sensational news illustrations rooted in common visual anchors, group portrait prints fortified with photovitamins, and the aggregated and fused photographs by Philadelphia pioneers the Langenheims comprise a few of the pictures of Michael's image ecology that he reviewed, and for which we will get a visual taste of today. I also cannot help but think about recent events, and many in power telling us not to believe our eyes, and how Michael's work challenges us to think about how we came to this point in our culture and how we read and understand the flood of pictures we bear witness to today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Leja. Michael Leja is James and Nan Wagner Farquhar Professor Emeritus of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. He is currently Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Lauder Research Center for Modern Art, Metropolitan Museum of Art. Prior books, including Looking Askance, Skepticism in American Art from Akins to Duchamp, and Reframing Abstract Expressionism, Subjectivity in Painting in the 1940s, both award winners. His research has been supported by several fellowships, including from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Getty Grant Program, and the Clark Art Institute. In 2025, he won the College Art Association Award for Distinguished Teaching in Art History. Michael, thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and the screen is now yours.
Thank you, Erica. That's a very nice introduction. Let me just set the screen share up here. Okay, I hope you're seeing my first slide. Great. Well, as Erica said, the Library Company was a crucial research resource for this publication, so I'm really pleased to be able to present the results of that research to its audience. I want to thank Erica and her colleagues, Jim Green, Sarah Weatherwax, and everyone I worked with at the Library Company was exceptionally generous. It was really a gift to have that institution just up the street in real life. Okay, let's get to business. So much of our 21st century lives unfolds in a flurry of pictures that we long ago ceased to recognize how historically unusual this is. Until about 200 years ago, People of ordinary means in the United States encountered pictures only rarely. That situation changed dramatically and abruptly in the early mid-19th century as the production of pictures became mechanized and industrialized, and as mass markets for pictures were shaped. Let me show you the full image. That's the cover image for the book. This is an advertisement from the Duval Lithography Company from 1840 in the form of a medley print in the collection of the Historical Society, right next door to the Library Company, another crucial institution for my research. A Flood of Pictures strives to provide a broad view of this transition as it occurred in the United States between 1830 and 1860. As in other countries, many new technologies for printing images enabled mass production, including lithography, wood engraving, steel plate engraving, and toward the end of this period, photography. Also, as elsewhere, considerable effort was involved in determining which subject matters, formats, and pictorial styles could have mass appeal across a population marked by conflict and difference. Conditions specific to the US presented particular challenges, since it was a nation still in formation with extreme and specific forms of disunity and diversity. The book attends both to the producers who were feeding the flood and to the audiences supporting it. Audience and reception data comes from all kinds of sources, including scrapbooks and furniture, which also indicate that consumers were becoming secondary producers, using mass-produced images as a creative medium. The book tries to recreate as much as possible what it felt like when pictures overtook the world, much the way digital media have overtaken ours. Public discourse in the antebellum era offers vivid insights into the enthusiasms and anxieties provoked by the flood of pictures, the gains and losses that were felt, and the ways that people were changing in response to them. I think this period is especially interesting because it was a time before successful pictorial formulas for mass appeal were established. Each project had to solve that riddle for itself. And it was a time before an audience habituated to consumption of pictures existed and before pictures had become thoroughly commodified. The kinds of pictures that started the flood include illustrations in books, pamphlets, and newspapers, full-sheet printed pictures collected in scrapbooks or albums or framed for hanging or applied to furniture, posters and broadsheets, photographs on cards, spectacular paintings displayed in theatrical venues, and more. As pictures entered mass circulation, they quickly began to supplement verbal texts and in some respects overshadow them to do all the things that pictures do among us now: convey news and information, portray people, places, and events, focus public discourse, sell things, educate and instruct, generate excitement and aesthetic gratification, promote and disguise political agendas, shape social identities, and build and undermine social bonds. The book identifies 7 projects that were instrumental to the remaking of picture production for mass distribution in the US. Each is the focus of a chapter in the book. That selection is informed by period commentary that spotlighted picturing projects that were exceptionally successful and were subsequently copied in the marketplace. I'll show you just one example of the kind of document that helped with that from the Cosmopolitan Art Journal, a period commentary that credits the Harper's Illuminated Bible with initiating the illustration mania that's described in this article. More about that particular case momentarily. Each of my 7 projects managed to appeal to a broad segment of a highly diverse, contentious, and factionalized population, large enough to circulate pictures in the tens or hundreds of thousands. The chapters also represent as fully as possible a cross-section of the media, subject matter, and functions that flourished in the pictorial flood. I'll give you very brief descriptions of 5 of the chapters and enlarge just a bit on 2 of them that Erica suggested might have special interest for this occasion. Both of those show photography entering into the flood. So the first chapter discusses the cheap newspapers of the 1830s, the penny press, that supported themselves through high volume sales. Illustrations of noteworthy events such as fires, shipwrecks, and sensational crimes, as well as preposterous hoaxes, were introduced to increase circulation. A disastrous fire in New York in 1835 gave one of these papers, the New York Herald, an opportunity to test its ability to feature an illustration, the one you see on the screen, which was meant to give readers a rough idea of the destruction of the new Merchants Exchange building that was the pride of the city. The paper boasted that this illustration was itself historic. It advised all readers, quote, to preserve this paper among the archives of their family. 50,000 copies only are printed. This is likely the first time that 50,000 copies of any picture were printed in the United States. Just as important to the flood of pictures as the wood engravings that appeared in the penny papers were the collaborations that the penny press forged with other image producers. The New York Sun, the chief rival of the Herald, teamed up with a rising young lithographer, Nathaniel Currier, to provide pictorial supplements illustrating disasters at sea. This lithograph of the fire on the steamboat Lexington that killed 120 people was in such demand that it was reissued every few days, updated with new information about the disaster. As those details were received, news was traveling much more slowly in those days, as you know. But already here, just 5 years after the New York fire, news images were meant to be replaced rapidly, not preserved in family archives. Another collaboration important to the penny press in New York was with Hannington's Dioramas, a scenic theater that produced immersive visual spectacles recreating the sensational events featured in the newspapers. When the British ship, the Mexico, ran aground and sank while approaching New York Harbor in midwinter 1837, Hannington's debuted its theatrical recreation just a few days after that disaster was reported. This image on the screen embodies the triangular collaboration to capitalize on news pictures. Currier's lithograph, published by the Sun as a news supplement. You see, it says published at the Sun office. Advertising Hannington's diorama production as now exhibiting at Hannington's Dioramas. And so you've got the Sun, the Currier's lithography firm, and Hannington's all collaborating to publicize this event. And here is an advertisement for Hannington's diorama running in the Sun around the same time. It's printed sideways. The picture is printed sideways, you see, to fit into 2 columns of text. There was all kinds of experimentation with presentation of images going on in these early days. The second chapter focuses on the presidential campaign of 1840, in which the Democratic incumbent, Martin Van Buren, ran against the Whig challenger, William Henry Harrison. Harrison's campaign was the first in the country to make heavy use of pictures to promote the candidate. Note that this was the 14th presidential election. There had already been 13 with little reliance on pictures. In the 18th century, portraits of George Washington were not campaign fodder, nor were they meant to enhance his brand. They were intended to inspire emulation. And in the 1820s and 30s, amid bitter political divisions, satirical lithographs portrayed presidents in a much less flattering light. But the use of mass-produced images by a campaign in 1840 was something new. Foreshadowing future elections, those pictures contributed to a glorified image that egregiously misrepresented the candidate and his career. Harrison was an undistinguished elderly veteran of battles against Native Americans who had retired from a lackluster political career to the modest position of clerk of the Court of Common Pleas in Hamilton County, Ohio. Pictures, like the one on the screen, helped to make him a cult figure. Here's another one. He was represented incessantly as a humble log cabin dweller, assiduously plowing his fields or welcoming travelers and old soldiers to join him for a glass of hard cider, when he was, in fact, a college-educated aristocrat from one of Virginia's wealthiest families. His father, a slaveholding plantation owner, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Harrison's campaign managers were shrewd operatives, and they discerned that the way to get their manufactured image out to rural voters would be through almanacs, like the Farmer's Almanac still published today. At least 9 Harrison-themed almanacs were published during the election year 1840, and here are 5 of them that are in the collection of the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. They represent a striking departure from previous almanacs, and they figured prominently in Harrison's defeat of Van Buren, who ran a traditional campaign free of pictures. Alongside the marketing of news and the promotion of political candidates, religious and moral advocacy was an essential motivation for early mass production of images. And the third chapter focuses on a profusely illustrated Bible published in installments between 1843 and 1846 by the Harper brothers in New York. And this picture shows you the massive heft of that volume. It was published like a magazine, with a new 20 or 25-page installment appearing by subscription or at booksellers every 3 or 4 weeks over a 3-year period at 25 cents per installment. It revolutionized publishing in the US, sold almost 100,000 copies, and inspired a host of followers. And among its innovations, it was allegedly the first illustrated work of any magnitude to be produced on a steam-powered press. As you've already seen, it was recognized in its time as a breakthrough publication. And there were many keys to that success, to that breakthrough, but I'll highlight just one in the time I have today. While it did include fine illustrations like this one, of the sort one normally expected to find in traditional, expensive, smaller edition illustrated Bibles, this Bible also included 1,400 thumbnail pictures drawn very simply in a style developed for children's publications. Here's St. Paul being lowered in a basket from the wall of Damascus. All of these thumbnail images, by the way, were drawn by John Gadsby Chapman, an artist some of you may be familiar with from from projects that he's much more recognized as being involved in. Although these small pictures are tiny presences on large pages, they use formal and narrative wit and spare but provocative compositions to draw our viewers' attention and to provoke curiosity. Many display a quaint, naive, slightly humorous quality, often associated with folk arts. Here's another one, The Sower. These ubiquitous little engravings ensured that engaging entryways into the text were never very far away. They brought the appeal of the homely fable or fairy tale to the Bible without diminishing the sacred text's dignity. This case calls our attention to illustrated children's books as an important pathway into the development of a mass visual culture in the United States. The fourth chapter is one that I'll give a little extra attention. In the 1830s and 40s, a pair of successful monthly political and literary magazines routinely published portraits of political leaders as frontispieces. That's the Democratic Review and the Whig Review, representing the two political parties of the time. And on the screen, you see 2 portraits of Thomas Hart Benton, Democratic senator from Missouri, as he was represented in the Democratic Review in 1837 on the left and 1843 on the right. The image on the right is engraved after a daguerreotype, as became common for these portraits in the early 1840s. One specialist in mezzotint engraving became especially adept at translating the look of a daguerreotype into a reproducible medium, and that person was Thomas Donne. Donne collaborated with photographer Edward Anthony to produce a series of remarkable frontispiece portraits that even now are sometimes misclassified in museum and library collections as photographs. So compare the portrait of Benton that you see on the right with one of Donne's images. Here, his portrait of former President Andrew Jackson, published in the Democratic Review in 1845, just in the days before Jackson died. Mezzotint's emphasis on tonal relations gave it special potential for translating photography, which Dani exploited fully. Here's the Anthony daguerreotype along with the print. If you compare them really closely, you can see it's an excellent translation that Dani's made. The eyes are a little brighter and not quite so droopy as in the photograph, but that's probably deliberate. Daguerreotypes were unique positive images on silver-coated metal plates, like a mirror image reversed, which was then re-reversed in the print. The daguerreotype images were elusive because of interference from reflections in the plate, and they were not reproducible except by rephotographing. So Dani was doing something quite remarkable in his copies of daguerreotypes. He was anticipating the look photographic prints would come to have in a decade or two once new photographic processes made possible paper prints with distinct forms and a broad tonal range. I'll show you a detail of that portrait so you can get a good sense of the fine modeling and the rendering that Dani's accomplished here. When Dani and Anthony announced that they would be collaborating on an undertaking that would be producing an extraordinarily large and ambitious print, which is this one, the Senate chamber, as seen during a farewell address by Henry Clay, containing 100 of their trademark portraits in a single image, when they announced that project, the public anticipation was intense. During the 3-year period while this print was being prepared, the press gave regular updates on the progress of the project. When it was published in 1846, the result was lavishly praised by both Democrats and Whigs. No doubt the orderly and dignified portrayal of the national governing body, which in fact was growing increasingly contentious over issues of slavery, war in Mexico, Western expansion, and so on, it appealed to many audiences for that orderly, dignified portrayal. Neither party seemed troubled by the formal disunity of the print. Henry Clay is singled out at the back of the chamber. He's allegedly giving his farewell address, although he's not shown speaking. And his colleagues pay little attention to him. Oh, and notice that the lighting is not very well. It's not very lifelike. It doesn't spotlight him. It's not used for dramatic effect. Although there is some shadowing on the faces of the figures flanking him. I think that's complete shadowing of those faces. It's not realistic, obviously, but it is an attempt to make Clay's face stand out somewhat. Here's another detail. As I said, neither party was troubled by the formal disunity of the print, the disconnections I'm referring to between the figures and the scattered and unfocused quality of the composition. Reviewers encouraged every public institution in the country to own a copy of this print, and government agencies presented them as diplomatic gifts to foreign countries. One reviewer noted that readers of senatorial debates would now be able to hold the likenesses of each speaker before them as they read. Faces and texts could be studied in concert. Demand for this print exceeded the plate's ability to supply. Printing had to be suspended so the shading, the forms could be reinforced, mostly with shading and some line engraving. So this print marks a transitional moment when market expansion was clearly exceeding the capacity of traditional image technologies. It also illustrated the mixing of visual media that was commonplace in the transition to a mass market visual culture. Hybrid images, in this case, one combining photographs and mezzotint, captivated audiences, as well as offering practical ways of increasing the size of an edition. Hybridity, whose presence was signaled by the disunity of parts, turned out to be an effective strategy for mass marketing pictures. Chapter 5 stars the internationally celebrated Swedish singer Jenny Lind, whose concert tour through the United States in 1850-51 made her a national sensation. Lind has been described as the first popular entertainer to achieve true celebrity in the United States. And not coincidentally, she was the first whose portraits achieved mass circulation. Her image appeared in unprecedented numbers in all popular media. Her tour promoter, P.T. Barnum, commissioned illustrated pamphlets and biographies before her arrival, and he made her available to portrait photographers in every city of the tour, which was about a dozen cities over 18 months. Local photographers competed for the privilege of making daguerreotypes of her, and many of those who secured a sitting commissioned lithographers or engravers to make large edition copies of their daguerreotypes. Here's on the left a print copy after the daguerreotype on the right, the Root brothers daguerreotype of Jenny Lind. The plethora of portraits of Lind circulating across the country gave rise to a national debate over which of them, if any, captured the singer's true greatness. One of the challenges Lind presented to her portraitists was the elusive beauty of her face. By all accounts, ravishing while singing, filled with inner inspiration and vitality, her face allegedly became far less attractive in ordinary circumstances. Here are two more print copies after that Root daguerreotype by different printmakers. The public discourse about Lind's face is relentless in expressing disappointment with her features when at rest. This goes beyond sexism to something like an irrational need to have an interior and exterior beauty coincide. Some commentators felt that prints stood a better chance of doing justice to Lind than did photographs, which were too constrained by attachment to mere material reality. Others proposed that the failure of so many photographers and printmakers to capture her true beauty meant that her face was unrepresentable. The puzzle over her elusive beauty was the crux of the first successful strategy for bringing celebrity images fully into the growing mass market for pictures. The central figures in the book's 6th chapter are the Langenheim brothers, photographers working in Philadelphia, who introduced a series of technical innovations and marketing schemes that contributed significantly to the development of mass marketable forms of photography in the 1850s. This is the 2nd chapter that I'll summarize in a little more detail. You see the two brothers, William and Frederick, in daguerreotype portraits of one another. The Langenheims were immigrants from Germany working as journalists for a German language newspaper in Philadelphia, who opened a daguerreotype studio in 1842. Most of the time, Frederick made the photographs, William managed the business, and both handled their responsibilities with ingenuity and ambition. Prominent figures, including Senator Henry Clay and President John Tyler, sat for photographic portraits by them. International fame came only 3 years after their business opened, that is in 1845, with their 5-plate daguerreotype panorama of Niagara Falls, which you see here. It was acclaimed by Daguerre himself when the brothers sent him a copy, and as well as by several European heads of state. The innovations of the Langenheims were motivated by two things: the compulsion to improve the quality and beauty of photographic images, and an equally intense desire to develop a technology allowing multiple copies of each photographic exposure. These two objectives were not always compatible. The brothers were the first in the US to get behind the calotype process, the paper negative process invented by Henry Fox Talbot, for which the Langenheims purchased licensing rights in the US in 1850. They saw the potential of the reproductive capacity of calotypes and worked to improve it. Here, Frederick revels in the multiplication of prints made possible through the calotype process. He's holding two identical self-portraits, and there's a third one bleeding off the right edge right here. Why they use the daguerreotype process in this picture to celebrate their calotype production is a question for another time. They soon moved from paper to glass negatives, an innovation recently introduced in Europe. Frederick extended this breakthrough by using glass negatives to print positive transparencies on glass. He recognized the potential of these transparencies for magic lantern projections, that is, for early slide projectors. In other words, he developed the first projectable photographic slides. He patented this process in 1850, naming the transparencies holotypes from the Greek word for glass, and his patent model for the process was characteristically clever. Here it is. This demonstration image showed the National Patent Office building in Washington, the destination of the model, which is now the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery. The fine detail of the holotype rivaled the daguerreotype, but in a projectable and reproducible form. Here's what the slides look like in their mounts. Langenheim's holotypes were exhibited at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, where a reviewer wrote that they were, quote, as near an approach to perfection as we can imagine. Their delicacy and the perfection of the details cannot be overstated, unquote. A French inventor who saw the Langenheim's holotypes at the Crystal Palace adapted them for stereoscopy, and the Langenheims eagerly followed his lead. Photographs on glass set into a stereoscope that allowed illumination from behind could produce striking and luminous images with strong spatial effects. Frederick Langenheim quickly recognized the potential of this idea and became one of the first photographers to market photographic stereographs in the US, developing both card and glass options simultaneously in 1854. I wish there were a way of showing stereographs to a Zoom audience in 3D, because they become quite different images when you see them that way. For example, looking at this slide on the screen of Astor Place from the Cooper Union, you probably barely notice the cement block at the lower right. Whereas when you look through a viewer, it jumps into your space and sets you floating mysteriously and precariously alongside it. The Langenheims marketed their stereographs in sets of noteworthy sights. Their marquee set included the principal attractions one encountered on a railroad trip to Niagara Falls, including the highlights of Niagara itself. The very same year that railroad consolidation enabled express service between Philadelphia and Niagara Falls, the Langenheims conceived the idea of publishing a series of stereographic photographs documenting scenery along that line and at Niagara. In order to fund the undertaking, they solicited subscriptions from a group of prominent people, many of whom were affiliated with the railroad and coal companies that stood to benefit from the success of these consolidated lines. That funding arrangement was described in an 1855 newspaper advertisement, which you see in the headline says, views taken upon the route of the Reading, Catawissa, Williamsport, and Elmira railroads on to Niagara Falls. And under testimonial toward the bottom, it says, we the undersigned, who by subscribing and furnishing Frederick Langenheim with the means to commence a new series of American stereoscopic views between Philadelphia and Niagara Falls, have received the number subscribed for and take pleasure in expressing our entire satisfaction with them, and would recommend them to all who have a desire to cultivate a taste for their own American works of art and skill. They are also colored with much taste and truthfulness to nature, unquote. In this version of the announcement, 9 distinguished names appear below the endorsement. In another version, the list is expanded to 21. Among the signatories are several managers of businesses that stood to gain: Samuel Sloan, the director of the Hudson River Railroad; John Tucker, president of the Reading Railroad; and Lyon Levy, director of a coal company associated with the Reading Railroad. Less scenic, but technologically important scenery was included in the sets. This view shows 7 miners, dinner apparently finished, posing at the mouth of a mine, along with a mule on the left side of the image, a mule that ignores the direction to remain still for the length of the exposure. It's the only figure out of focus in the shot. Or it might be shivering. It might have been cold. Because snow whitens the entire scene, even the tops of the men's helmets. And it sets off the pitch black openings into the mine that recede far into the space that's delineated above ground by the building. The coal the men are dragging up to the light would fuel the steam locomotive that enabled the photographers to produce this image. Viewers in New York and Philadelphia at this time would not have had many opportunities to see photographs of the mines and miners who were supplying the fuel for the industrialization and modernization reshaping their cities. These sets of stereographs were exercises in virtual tourism at a moment when tourism was becoming, in the US, a preferred form of middle-class leisure. Funding such photographic travelogues through sponsorship by railroad companies became a substantial source of support for other photographers who followed the Langenheim's lead. Unfortunately for the Langenheims, it's a longer story, but the short version is that their primary commitment to more expensive glass over card stereographs prevented them from reaping the financial benefits to be gotten during the stereograph vogue that they helped to build. Here's just the final shot I'm showing you is the railroad bridge. Technological achievements associated with the sites that they were going to were also featured in these series. And here again, if you were seeing this in 3D, those almost invisible little strands of grass in the foreground jump into your space and really mark off your distance from the railroad engine on the bridge in middle ground. All right, finally, the 7th chapter discusses a landmark Boston publication titled Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, a pictorial companion for home and family. Here you see its press room as illustrated in its own pages. And note that women are feeding paper into the steam presses. Women were involved in this flood of pictures, although they are seldom given much attention or credit. A cross between a magazine and a newspaper, larger than a magazine, smaller than a newspaper, Gleason's featured many wood-engraved illustrations in its weekly issues. It followed a pattern set by an English publication that truly revolutionized the circulation of printed images, the Illustrated London News, which established the model for what was called a pictorial miscellany. It combined stories and illustrations related to news events, travel features, fiction, and general interest topics, and it was comparatively light on education and moral uplift, slanted rather toward entertainment. Within a year of the Illustrated London News's debut in 1840, it was copied in France and Germany, along with many other countries to follow shortly after. Several attempts by US publishers to produce an illustrated New York News and an illustrated American News failed after very short runs. It was not until 1851, with Gleason's Pictorial, that a US publisher finally succeeded in adapting the formula. The reasons for that success are more complicated than I can summarize here, but I'll say only that Gleason shrewdly adapted an already successful dime novel publishing enterprise, his paper, The Flag of Our Union. He adapted that existing publication to focus on the delivery of pictures. It already included some small pictures, as you can see from this example. And here's the first edition of Gleason's Pictorial, which had a format and a look very different from the publication we've come to know as Gleason's Pictorial, which only really starts publishing in that finished format after 6, I think, issues in this early form. You'll notice the water stain on this image. I believe this is the only extant copy of this first issue of Gleason's Pictorial. It's in the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. In the book's illustration, and that is in the illustrations included in the flood of pictures, I took many opportunities to acknowledge marks of deterioration in the material produced. Just because, although each of the projects I'm discussing generated enormous editions of pictures, many barely survive in hard copy, this being one of the most important cases. Gleason's 8-year run, which involved a name change to Ballew's Pictorial, paved the way for better-known successors, including Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. Like other publications in this genre, it experimented with ways of organizing illustrations. Here you see a page from 1859 from Ballew's Pictorial. And these more complicated organizations of illustrations indicated advancing stages of sophistication among both designers and viewers. Okay, well, to conclude this presentation, I mentioned at the beginning that I was eager to understand in this project the gains and losses that the flood of pictures was felt to bring, and the ways people were changing in response to the flood. So let me end with some thoughts about this. The flood generated plenty of excitement and popular approval, but it also caused alarm. Just to quickly list some of the worries articulated at the time about habituation to pictures, some considered pictures childish things, liable to diminish one's capacities for sophisticated thought. Others worried that their personal powers of imagination were being compromised. What if rampant illustration rendered creative visualization superfluous? Some doubted that the quality of mass-produced images and the preferred subject matter would be good enough to have any salutary effects on the taste and discrimination of mass viewers. Some felt that excessive picturing, what they termed promiscuous production of pictures, was making print culture gaudy and vulgar. Later commentators would worry that firsthand experience would be upstaged by images, that pictures would completely replace words as the default means of communication, and that human brains would be affected. So we can see that from the beginning, iconophilia and iconophobia, desire for pictures and wariness of them, went hand in hand. Now it's addictive Instagram feeds and deepfake AI videos that worry us, while we consume as many pictures as our internet connections allow. At least one person experiencing the flood back in the mid-19th century felt his brain being remade, and he found the new shape of it exciting. Poet Walt Whitman found enjoyment and hope in the new visual world thick with pictures he was experiencing. He immersed himself in it, and in 1850, he wrote what he called a poem of pictures. You see the notation for it, kind of the plan for it there on the screen. Each verse presenting a picture of some characteristic scene, event, group, or personage. The poem consists of 14 pages of concise descriptions of images in no particular order in what seems a string of free associations. In it, he portrayed his head as a picture gallery in which a tumult of pictures represents his memory, life experience, and literary work. So already in the 1850s, at least one important author was reimagining established paradigms of writing, thinking, and being in light of his experience of a mass visual culture. That was only the beginning. And that's where I'm ending. Let me stop sharing.
Sorry about a little technical difficulty there. Thank you so much, Michael. That was wonderful. I kind of circled at the end. You're talking about the desire and wariness of so many pictures in our lives then and now. So the we have some time for questions. So please feel free to start filling in the Q&A, and I see the questions are already coming in. But I was going to self-indulge and ask the first question, if I may, and I guess I will since I'm in charge here, at least for the moment. I was curious because you title your book Flood of Pictures. And there are a variety of choices that you could have used to describe, graphics or images, and you chose the word pictures. And I know you say why you did that in the introduction. And I just curious, was that a quick and easy decision, or did it take some contemplation to decide to go with pictures?
No, I mean, I did feel a commitment early on to go with pictures, but then I used the term pictures so much in the book that I had to resist the temptation to throw in other terms just for variety. And I resisted because I was afraid that there would be ambiguity attached to those other terms. The word image, for example, I mean, the idea of, the image in American culture has, many meanings, image meaning deception or all kinds of things. Uh, I wanted to stick with pictures because it's a term that's used in the period as a generic category for all kinds of images. And I cite in the book, as you know, a quotation from Godey's lady's book from an article that says, hang up a picture in your living room or something. And it says when one picture is worn out, to throw it away and hang up another one. And it gives as examples, lithographs, wood engravings, the kinds of things that would all have been included in the category pictures at that moment. And it's very different from the way we might think of the category pictures today. But yes, that term seemed to be inevitable. And especially in the title of the book, pictures appears twice, a flood of pictures, the formation of a picture culture. I was advised by some readers that I should change the second picture to image or something else, but I resisted because I wanted pictures to hold the stage.
Yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate that. No, thank you. Yeah, I was curious. I'm glad to hear your answer. So we do have some questions. So I will start going through them. We might run out of time to go through all of them, but let's see what we can do. The first one is in the Senate group portrait, were the foreground figures seen from the back also senators, specific ones? How do their invisible faces work with the function of the image as a group portrait?
That's a good question. There are so many awkwardnesses in that picture. I don't think I think those are just placeholders. Those four invisible figures, um, and those are the hugest by far in the print. The largest because they're in the foreground. The most important ones in the distance are the smaller. It was not Dunny's design that was used for this composition. They actually hired a painter to propose a design for them, and Donnie just filled in the portraits as they were as he was inclined to. But yes, the strangeness of that arrangement. I guess they felt that it was the best option they had. It given I mean, they were also interested in giving a very realistic representation of the chamber, the actual architecture of the chamber. And they did that to such a degree that when the chamber it was later renovated and some of its original dimensions and design was destroyed. This print was used to reconstruct the original look of the chamber by preservationists. So the print there's some redeeming features in its architectural information that make up for the awkwardness in its presentation of the senators.
Great, thank you. Next question. How important were literacy rates of the population to the rise of pictures?
Well, in the U.S., literacy rates were uncommonly high, and so undoubtedly that helped to to make some of these illustrated publications that were the carriers of illustrations more popular. Um, uh, I mean, I think there's also a way in which illustration was an advantage when one was trying to reach an audience of people who did not speak English, came from different countries, had different cultural backgrounds. So English language fluency and reading literacy could both be tempered. I mean, differences in those things could be tempered by pictures. And I think that was one of the ways that they were used early on. But because the rates were surprisingly high in the US, that facilitated the growth of the of the flood of pictures.
And I'm going to try and go in order of questions, but I just since you just ended your answer with flood of pictures, there is a question. I wonder if you can discuss why you chose the word flood to describe this inundation of pictures in the mid-19th century. Was this the way it was described at the time?
Inundation, whether you called it the questioner calls it an inundation. That's that's just another word for flood in my lexicon. No, yes, no, flood does come up. So does inundation, um, blizzard. I mean, there are all kinds of natural forces that seem to be the compelling metaphors for what's happening with the proliferation of pictures at this time. But I did lean toward flood because I think that flood and inundation metaphors are more prominent than any others.
Great, thank you. It's right. I once, in thinking about flood of pictures, or I think sometimes it was described as kind of like visual bombardment. I was like, I sometimes feel like folks getting kind of a wash in the imagery, or in pictures. But that might be something like a side conversation you can have between
Yeah,
being flooded or washing over. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
yes, and I think I'll take this occasion to say that the idea that the proliferation of pictures was a flood or some kind of natural force obscures the fact that it's actually a human-made thing. That this is something that didn't have to happen. It was because there was demand for it and hunger for it, and people said that they were discovering um, what was it called? A natural taste for pictures.
Hmm.
There was some kind of attraction to pictures that was being triggered by this new availability of images. But the idea that it's a natural force can make us forget, that it's a historical man-made creation, one that we can control.
Yeah, and that's something just made me think what I also appreciated with your book is that, and I know I've fallen sometimes, I guess I'll call it a trap, but being like, okay, well, it's because of, technology that really, forced, so many pictures out into the culture and into society. And you make a point that it was sort of neither nor, either or, that they were, it was a duality, that it was the technology was feeding it, but it was the culture feeding the technology, which I really appreciate. So go get the books, folks. Next question. Not wanting to be oblivious about today's protest, could you share some thoughts if during your research process you found images contributing to narratives of nativism or xenophobia?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Racism, sexism, all kinds of ethnographic bias. Um, well, this opens up a whole area of the book I'd love to have time to talk about, which is how mass audiences were constituted by these different projects. Um, I try to make the point in the book that there is not one mass audience that results from this flood of pictures. There are many mass audiences, and they are designed to fit the kind of project that producers were making. So in some cases, in almost all cases, there were groups of people who were being othered in order to appeal to some segment of the population. And that othering often took shape along lines of race, ethnicity, and sex. So there are many images that have all kinds of of um, of, uh, of biased stereotypes and caricatures in them, and those tended not to be the ones that achieved the greatest circulation. But there were implicit in the ones that did achieve the great circulation, the same kinds of biases in more subtle ways.
Great.
I guess that's the
Um,
best brief answer I can give to that very good
yeah,
question.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Just about it's about 2:28. I know we're set to end at 2:30. We still have quite a few questions. If folks are willing, I'm going to go a little bit over. Please, stay or leave as you need to. And I can always get questions to Michael as well after this to respond. Someone did ask if the talk was going to be available online. Yes, and made a note. Ray Brain being remade. See Roland Allen, The Notebook: A History of Thinking on Paper, pages 366 to 370. There's a question about what was the thought given to the preservation of pictures? To what extent were the possible dangers to the preservation of pictures known at the time of the production of them?
These were all ephemeral pictures, so there wasn't much interest in preservation, except for something extraordinary like the Donny Senate Chamber, um, or maybe the Langenheim stereographs were magnificent things, but most of them are broken or have been damaged through time. So this was not a realm of images where museum quality preservation issues ever came up, I think.
So I was also just thinking of your picture, what was it, the Gleason's Pictorial, which had the watermark, and thinking
Yes,
flood, and it's like it seems like it was damaged by a flood.
yes, right.
But
Good, thank
metaphors
you.
there. Another question for you. What role did cartooning play in this flood of pictures? I note that American, U.S. cartoonists were producing such images as commentary on political, social, and cultural matters and disseminating them through the reproduction and distribution means you highlight.
Well, cartooning, there's a couple of kinds of cartooning. There's political caricature satires that are being posted in coffee shops and public spaces, and those are influential and important, but they're not being produced at mass at levels that are like those of the case studies I've highlighted in the book. I mean, when we're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands, it's a very small number of projects that actually qualify for that kind of volume. But there are cartoons that are like they're like or some of them actually are almanacs that are humorous almanacs, and some of the same illustrators who were working on some of the projects that I described were actually participating also in those cartoonish publications, and I think those sometimes became successful, but not to the extent that the projects that I've settled on did.
Great, thank you. Uh, well, I'm going to try and I feel like I have a flood of questions that I'm trying to get through. To expand on your last example of Whitman sensing his ways of thinking, knowing, changing because of his particular exposure to pictures, even as the flood of images grew a national audience for visual culture, did you find that it also exacerbated differences between those who could not read, who did not have access to illustrated print?
I didn't find material that would allow that fine grain a distinction. I didn't, I mean, most of these things were relatively inexpensive, and many of them were shared, even when they were, dirt cheap, they were still being shared by groups. And I did find evidence of something like Gleason's Pictorial being shipped out to rural areas, and the person buying a copy at a bookseller and oh no, I'm sorry, it was the Harper's Bible that was being shipped to a bookseller at one of the installments and being shared by a number of people reading it together, and someone commenting, I think it's reasonably accurate an observation that a very diverse audience was looking together at this publication. So my sense is it's certainly not everyone who's getting access to these images, but it's a pretty broad segment of the population that can get access to it if it wants it. And I didn't see any expressions of people feeling like they were being deliberately excluded or left out of this phenomenon.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and bundle some questions. And so forgive and if you lose a thread, I can hopefully get you back, get that thread back for you. So it's a question about what role did Philadelphia play in the rise of pictures? When did wall calendars with pictures start? And could you talk a little bit more about whether the pictures, especially in something like Gleason's, were taken as truth or artist fiction?
Okay, so wall calendars, those are mostly chromolithographic mass publication things, which would be a post-Civil War phenomenon, post-bellum phenomenon. Chromolithography. I mean, what I've described is really just the first stage in an ever-expanding, field of pictures in the culture. So, it continues to grow, and there's a rapid spurt after the war, after Harper's Weekly and others become so essential to reporting on the war, and chromolithography begins to reach a mass audience. Stereo cards, cartes de visite. There's a huge expansion. So that's the calendar. Then there was, sorry, sorry, Erica, would you repeat those?
No, sure. Sorry, and let me. I'm sorry. I was like going ahead, like trying to. So it was about the role Philadelphia played in the rise
Oh,
of
Philadelphia.
pictures. And then it was if you could talk a little if the pictures in Gleason's were they taken as truth or artist fiction?
Well, in Gleason's, I think in many cases, the pictures were so schematic and sketchy that I have to imagine that people were taking them as really kind of minimal armatures for for a way to visualize what they're reading about. So I can't, if you look at the pictures in Gleason's that are related to news events, and not all of them are, many of them are related to fiction that's being, there are stories that are sequentially being produced in monthly issues, weekly issues, and uh, the pictures associated with them don't have the truth question. But I think the news images are they're I can't tell. I don't know for sure. I can't. There's no way I can really know how much credibility people were giving them. There are certainly ways in which they are biased, and I talk in the book about revisions that are made in Gleason's pages from one issue to a reissue. Some images get republished, and certain things get left out. So there is some bias being factored into the presentation of the pictures that a publication like Gleason's is presenting. But it's hard to imagine that anyone would be seeing them as something like a photographic record, having anything like the truth of a photograph of the events that they portray.
Right.
And then Philadelphia being a center of publication was one of the important centers. New York, Philadelphia, Boston are the centers that get most of the attention in the book, just because those are the places where the publishing industry and the image publishing and the photography industries seem to have the biggest footprint and the greatest progress.
Thank you, Michael. All right, given our time, I'm going to ask about one or two more questions for you and our audience. Thank you, everyone, for continuing. It's hard to escape the parallels between the flood of pictures in the 19th century and today, but could you say some more about what you see as distinctive about the antebellum period?
Well, what's distinctive to me is that it's when people are non-native consumers of pictures becoming accustomed to seeing the world through images. All of us, anyone living today is, we're native um, picture lovers, picture users. We were born reading. I mean, we were in the crib as children. We were reading illustrated books, and we've been being fed pictures, increasingly so. So there are ways in which we take things for granted. Our brains have been shaped in ways that make processing pictures very easy. And we have ways of processing pictures that are different from the ways they were being looked at when people were new to this practice. I mean, the kind of scanning we do, the very rapid scanning, and then moving on to the next picture and this, the form of looking, the style, the cognitive style of seeing that we've developed is for our kind of environment. The kind that people were using in the antebellum period was very rough and ready. The pictures take a different kind, they take kind of pondering to make out forms. They're not made for scanning. They're made for a different kind of looking. And I think viewers and image producers are learning together how to work with pictures in an efficient and effective way. So I think it's radically different, that moment from our moment. And I'd love to go more into trying to draw out those differences. That's a really productive course to follow, I think.
Great. Well, and I also think this is a period of time, and again, maybe this is like the chicken and egg question, but also that, a lot of the images are so small, like the thumbnails in the Bible, that in some ways to really, grasp the image or the close looking, like you need a magnifier, some kind of, some magnification to really see them. And I know, there were, not optician store, selling picture magnifying glasses so individuals could look at the images. And even with, my young eyes, I probably would still need something to that effect. All right. Thank you, everyone. I fear I'm not going to be able to get through all the questions, so this will be the last question. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Last question. You spoke about the role of the development of printing and photographic technologies. Could you also comment on the role of commodities, paper, ink presses, and labor, printers, illustrators, distributors?
Yes, right. That's a very good point. And rolled paper, mass production of ink, rail distribution nationwide. There are so many forms of infrastructure and material substrate development that are essential to this flood of pictures. I didn't go into all of those. I mean, I mentioned them, but I did not go into them. I think that's a whole other study. And there have been many studies of aspects of that series of developments. But it's absolutely true that there would have been no flood of pictures without all of those other material and communications channels. The postal service, there's just a whole range of things that are at the periphery of this book that don't get the kind of attention that they should get in a more thorough study, but were essential to the subject.
Great. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. And I must admit, I have like a few questions that I didn't get a chance to ask, and but I know I know where you are. I know how to get in
Good.
touch with you. And I will say, for the folks whose questions I wasn't able to ask, if you want to send them my way, or potentially some of you have Michael's information, please feel free to send them to Michael so he can further this conversation and answer your questions. But this was a wonderful Friday afternoon to have, given the cray-cray that's going on in our world right now. So, and making us think about what we're seeing today as well. So, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope everyone has a good weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Erica. Thank
You're
you,
so
everyone.
welcome. Bye-bye.